Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Today's event is Fractured Foundations, Assessing Risks to Hong Kong's Business Environment. My name is Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across its 15 other programs and centers. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center for their partnership in putting on today's event and publishing the report we are launching today by Rhodium Group partner Logan Wright. This report comes at a critical time for Hong Kong, which has historically been the most important doorway to the Chinese market and financial system. However, Hong Kong's legal and political structure has fundamentally changed since the implementation of the national security law in 2020. With changes of this magnitude, it is difficult to know what shifts are transitory and what adjustments will become permanent features of Hong Kong's political and commercial environment. One important question, which Logan and our panelists will delve into further this morning, is what these changes in Hong Kong could mean for the viability of its independent currency and its peg to the US dollar via the linked exchange rate system, with the credibility of Hong Kong's one country, two systems policy now seriously in question. Additionally, Hong Kong's independent media and judicial system, which are cornerstones to a free and equitable civil society, have undergone enormous change in this short time, with implications for the business community, as well as for human rights and the rule of law. Crackdowns on media outlets endanger the flow of information necessary to conduct commercial and financial transactions. And the government's use of new sources of authority to seize data and control of company information creates new risks for businesses managing both internal and customer data. Hong Kong is now clearly at a turning point, with emerging risks to the commercial operating environment, raising questions about whether it can remain a global financial hub amid such drastic and apparently lasting changes. The report we are launching today provides an objective framework to assess that question. We could not have found a better author for a study on this critical and complex topic than Logan Wright, who leads the Rhodium Group's China markets research with a focus on China's financial system and credit conditions in shaping outcomes within China's economy, as well as the policies of China's central bank. Logan and the China markets research team at Rhodium monitor China's real economic conditions, financial market developments, and future policy directions to gauge the influence of China's economy on global financial markets. You will soon hear from Logan on the paper's main findings, as well as from an esteemed panel of experts on this topic. But first, it's my honor to introduce the moderator of today's program, Eva Do. Eva is the Washington Post's China business and economy correspondent. A Detroit native, she has recently returned from China and previously spent 7 years reporting on politics and technology for the Wall Street Journal in Beijing and Taipei. She was part of the Wall Street Journal's team that won the 2018 Loeb Award for international reporting for a series on China. We are truly privileged to have her with us today. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here today. And the way this is going to work, we're going to have Logan introduce his paper and talk a bit about his findings to kick us off. And after that, we're going to bring in our panelists, Johanna, Thomas, and Victor, who will be zooming in. So I guess to kick us off, Logan, I know you've been thinking a lot about what the changes in Hong Kong mean for businesses in the short term and long run. So maybe you could just introduce your main findings.
Yeah, sure.
To begin with.
Thanks, Eva. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Dave. Thanks everyone for being here today. And please encourage you to take a look at the report when it is published, and it is being published and it's available now online. So the idea of the report is we know the changes in Hong Kong have been truly fundamental. The legal and institutional environment has shifted from an environment in which it used to depend overwhelmingly on British common law and the basic law, and it shifted toward a system that is reinforced by political norms from Beijing under the national security law, or political norms more generally. And rather than those norms being set in by Hong Kong's local authorities, they're increasingly being reinforced by the trends in Beijing itself. So for businesses, this is a challenge because how can you objectively assess what's actually going to be changing more permanently and what's going to be a transitory development that's the result of a shorter term political campaign. And the paper is meant to provide an objective assessment of what has actually fundamentally changed. And this is one of the areas I think that, and I know we'll talk about this, is about the currency itself and Hong Kong's linked exchange rate system, which I think is very vulnerable to these kinds of changes in the institutional environment. So I can continue talking about that, or if you'd like me to, yeah.
So one of your findings is about the exchange rate, and could you talk a bit about about that and what it means for businesses?
So, I mean, I think that it's underappreciated how rare it is to have a situation in global finance where one country has two currencies. That is not a very typical or sustainable environment most often. And Hong Kong's always had what we used to many people referred to as the 2047 problem, which is that after the end of the one country, two systems policy under the Basic Law, after the 50 years after the 1997 handover, it was questionable whether the Hong Kong dollar would continue to survive. I mean, what would be the rationale for continuing it if all of a sudden Chinese sovereignty is complete? But now the problem is that, is there really going to be as much of a break between the present day and 2047? Is anything fundamentally going to change after 2047, given the changes that have already taken place under the national security law? So people are starting to question, I mean, the institutional arrangements behind the Hong Kong dollar and the linked exchange rate system right now. And it's sort of fast forwarding some of these discussions into the present day. The issue is not so much, in my view, will there be an external shock or some period of capital outflows that would overwhelm the HKMA's ability to defend the currency. The issue is more, are there going to be changing priorities in Beijing that weaken the institutional foundations of the defense of the exchange rate? For example, if there are massive capital outflows from Beijing, and Hong Kong is a critical conduit for those outflows, is there going to be the possibility that Beijing would want to weaken the Hong Kong dollar system in order to limit those outflows over time? And it doesn't necessarily have to be about the discovery of any, why do we think this is plausible? Because it's happened before. In 2016, 2017, there were pretty significant capital outflows from China, and there was already, pretty significant interventions from the Chinese authorities into Hong Kong's local markets via tightening the offshore supply of renminbi and jeopardizing some of the development of the offshore renminbi market, at least temporarily, in order to raise interest rates and stop some of those capital outflows over time. So the concern is really more that given this change in the institutional environment, if Beijing's priorities change, what will then be the argument for retaining the Hong Kong dollar peg? The HKMA will certainly say that they're committed to it, but are their preferences as important as what Beijing's preferences are? There's no objective reason that the peg needs to change, that it's going to come under short-term threat, but every fixed exchange rate regime depends upon essentially the credibility of the institutional environment surrounding it. And that is exactly what's come under pressure in recent years.
Mm-hmm. In your paper, you sort of lay out the series of changes that companies have faced in Hong Kong in recent years. Could you give us sort of like a summary version of what are sort of the main changes over the years that we have seen up through COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically ever since the national security law was put in place, which, there weren't as many fundamental changes that took place immediately after the 2019 protests. The national security law was Beijing's response to the 2019 protests. And then since then, we've seen, the dynamic of COVID restrictions is in a certain way kind of a microcosm in the way that Beijing's governance has changed in Hong Kong and the priorities of the local government. Essentially, what you have is a situation where the local authorities still have a lot of autonomy to, potentially resist or alter some of the COVID restrictions that Beijing is supposedly pressuring, but they're not really using it. And so what you saw is under, COVID policy, Hong Kong managed this, very effectively, I would say, in 2020 and early 2021. With effective controls of the border before there was a vaccine, then a reasonably effective vaccination program in early 2021, which it had shortcomings which were later very deadly. But up until April, May 2021, things could be argued that Hong Kong was moving toward relaxing COVID controls very much in line with the rest of the world and reopening to the rest of the world. Then the priorities seemed to shift toward reopening the border with the mainland first. And when that occurred, I think a lot of what happened for the business community in Hong Kong really changed. Because all of a sudden, there were no clear criteria for what it would take to reopen the border. There were no clear criteria of what you had to do. And so Hong Kong's domestic environment became far more restrictive. You were talking about pursuing mainland-style policies of isolating individual cases and quarantining close contacts. And that was hugely disruptive for business at the same time. And so, many businesses didn't want to operate where if there was one close contact in your office, your whole office might be shut down, or many members of your office might actually be sent to a quarantine facility for a week or so until they pass through these periods. So the problem was essentially that as mainland policy ended up dictating the way in which Hong Kong's quarantine and COVID policies were pursued, the loss of local autonomy, limited what government could do to provide credibility and transparency to the business sector. At one point, SIFMA, the financial market lobbying organization, in November 2021, wrote a letter clearly calling for just some sort of roadmap out of the quarantine measures that were taking place. And rather than responding with a more constructive path along that roadmap, the response was basically to tighten controls domestically further. And all of this has contributed to the problem of how do you attract talent in Hong Kong? How do you get people to stay there? And how do you get people to stay there? Because all of this pattern of governance in which it's less transparent, it's less technocratic overall has contributed to this loss of confidence in the business environment overall. Mm-hmm. And COVID, policy has really been sort of a microcosm of that.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that viewers are probably interested in with this paper is your recommendations for businesses facing these kind of challenges and changes and uncertainty. What would you recommend that businesses do?
Sure. I mean, I think that it's a difficult environment because you're basically pushing against, dramatic political changes that have already taken place. But Hong Kong values its reputation and its status as an international financial center, which collectively provides a certain degree of leverage to the business community. Collectively, it means if you're lobbying for certain things in a concerted fashion, then you're probably going to at least receive a hearing because the volume of deal flow, the number of people working in the industry, the state of markets is a very important indicators that the government is going to continue to track and value, and therefore that provides sort of a basis for engagement. So one of the recommendations we provide in the paper is to approach this outreach sort of like a political campaign. Approach this in essence as a lobbying effort that's not based on particular policies, but trying to say that these are the aspects of Hong Kong that business values, and this is exactly what needs to be protected over this time, which can at least help to slow some of the institutional changes that are already taking place.
Well, thank you so much for your introduction to the paper. At this point, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have two panelists in person and also one virtual. Johanna Gao is a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. She also serves as regional director for Asia at the International Republican Institute. She has more than 20 years of experience in international political development, nonprofit management, and citizen empowerment, and has lived and worked in the Asia region most of her life. She previously served with IRI in Burma, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Timor-Leste. Before joining IRI, Johanna worked as a consultant with the UN in Indonesia, coordinated policy programs for the Asia Society in Hong Kong, and previously worked with Time magazine. Johanna was born and grew up in Hong Kong, and she graduated from the University of Chicago with a degree in political science and completed her Master of Laws at the University of Hong Kong. So please welcome Johanna.
Thank you.
Thomas Kellogg is Executive Director of the Center for Asian Law, where he oversees various programs related to law and governance in Asia. He's a leading scholar of legal reform in China, Chinese constitutionalism, and civil society movements in China. Before joining Georgetown Law, Professor Kellogg was director of the East Asia program at the Open Society Foundations. At OSF, he oversaw the expansion of the foundation's work in China and has also launched its work on Taiwan and North and South Korea. During his time at OSF, Professor Kellogg focused most closely on civil society development, legal reform, and human rights. He also oversaw work on a range of other issues, including public health, environmental protection, and media development. So welcome to Thomas.
Thank you.
And our third panelist is Victor Shi. Victor is an expert on the politics of Chinese banking policies, fiscal policies, and exchange rate, as well as the elite politics of China. He's the author of 2 books published by the Cambridge University Press. First one's Factions and Finance in China, Elite Conflict and Inflation. And the second one, Coalitions of the Weak, Elite Politics in China, from Mao's Stratagem to the Rise of Xi. He's also the editor of Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability, Duration, Institutions, and Financial Conditions, published by the University of Michigan Press. She also published widely in a number of journals, including the American Political Science Review, Comparative Politics Studies Journal of Politics, the China Quarterly, and Party Politics. He's an associate professor of political economy and is currently engaged in a study of the activities of the Chinese elites and of Chinese defense firms around the world. He's also maintaining a large database on biographical information of elites in China. So welcome to Victor as well. And so at this point, we're going to go to each of our panelists to have sort of an opening statement. And then after that, we're going to open it up to a discussion, including Q&A from the audience. So maybe we can start with Johanna.
Sure.
Talk a bit about your work and your view on this issue.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, congratulations, Logan, on this report and for bringing us here today. So just jumping in, I think it's useful to start in 2020. I mean, I recognize the report focuses on, obviously, the uncertainties that stemmed from Beijing's imposition of the national security law at that time. I would argue that I think Beijing had done a lot to increase uncertainties in Hong Kong much before 2020. But I think starting on 2020 as a starting point, the reason why I think that's useful is the systematic and fairly brutal crackdown on democratic freedoms in Hong Kong that took place through 2019 into 2020 coincided with, as Logan was talking about, this sort of crazy and prolonged COVID lockdown in Hong Kong. And so, I think we could say that coincidence, this confluence of those things, maybe created a sort of a fog, right? That Hong Kong was to a large extent inaccessible to outsiders, maybe even to sort of the foreign companies and who are trying to look at it because of the lockdown, because of the quarantine rules. And so, I think an argument could be made that because of that, it wasn't that easy for those of us outside to really see, to get a real sense of how much Hong Kong had changed. But here we are in 2023. The restrictions are being lifted, the fog is lifting, and so there is an opportunity now to look at Hong Kong and really see where we are. So what do we see? We're seeing the Hello Hong Kong campaign. One of the things that I concluded from reading this report, which I think corresponds to what we've been tracking, is that American companies, maybe foreign companies more broadly, have been quite slow to recognize this really seismic shift that's taken place in Hong Kong, right? From the Hong Kong it used to be, this place of one country, two systems, to what it is now, which, from my perspective, is just now the one country. And so I tried to think about how to frame some of this in a way that would be meaningful to the companies and to their largest shareholders, right? The sort of institutional investors who I imagine are going to be really interested in this report. And so I wanted to highlight 3 ways that I think Hong Kong has been fairly fundamentally reshaped because of the changes that have been imposed by Beijing that make it less like the Hong Kong it used to be and much more like China. And I think if that is true, then companies really need to do a very different kind of risk analysis about their decisions to treat Hong Kong as a global financial hub. So first of all, from a rights perspective, right, I would say that it is getting much harder now to distinguish Hong Kong from the PRC. The various pillars of freedom and democratic society that Hong Kong people enjoyed, I think, are gone. Anyone who has worked on issues that touch on any element of human rights in China will know how much the space for operating in that area really depends on the political whim of the CCP, pretty much at any level. When we did this work inside China, we'd always talk about these red lines, red lines that couldn't be crossed because they were too politically sensitive. And now we're seeing that also play out in Hong Kong. As a very simple example, it is impossible right now for me to talk to civic activists in China because of their fear of being swept up because of discussing politically sensitive issues, no matter what those are. The fact that the same thing can be said now about civic activists in Hong Kong, I think tells you pretty much everything you need to know about how much freedom of expression in Hong Kong has changed. There's 47 people on trial right now for exercising the democratic practice to choose representatives, an activity that was legal at the time it took place and has now crossed the line into being illegal because of the NSL. You look at this week where, the first request for a protest post-COVID, post-NSL was made by a women's organization to commemorate International Women's Day. That was denied. So a lot of observers have talked about the fact that, the COVID restrictions and Logan did a nice job of sort of talking about how that shifted in 21, that these COVID restrictions ultimately weren't about COVID, they were political. And so I think with the broad reach of the national security law means there's a very high likelihood that just the everyday exercise of Hong Kong people's civic and political rights will at some point trigger national security concerns. So the second way I think there's been this fundamental change is from a rule of law perspective. I'm going to touch briefly because I know Tom is probably going to be talking about that a lot more. So, I'm a native Hong Konger. I used to be so proud of Hong Kong's really strong rule of law tradition and reputation. The fact that it would be sort of held up as this model of anti-corruption in the region. But with the national security law, seemingly the sort of supreme law of the land, and I think the door having been kicked wide open in terms of Beijing's political preferences guiding legal decisions, I think a question I have is, are companies prepared to remain in Hong Kong if it's a rule by law environment? I do think companies need to think about the implications of having significant operations in Hong Kong when they may be treated no differently than if they were in the mainland. And then the third fundamental change, and one that I think is touched on in the report when we talk about data security, and I think is maybe even an issue even closer to home for most companies, is that of intellectual property. Right? I am no IP expert, but it has been long recognized that operating on the mainland means significant risks of IP theft. Right? So 6 years ago, the US IP Commission estimated the annual cost to the US economy of IP theft was possibly up to $600 billion, and much of that in the hands of China. And I think a less independent, more politicized judiciary, coupled with the application of the national security law, means that this real risk in China now has to be applied quite equally to Hong Kong. And so, just to close out here, this isn't the Hong Kong that it was, right? It's not the Hong Kong of 2000, 2005, 2010. I think anyone who is trying to say that Hong Kong is back is seeking to shape a narrative around a Hong Kong that just no longer exists. I do think that the sooner companies and their largest shareholders really recognize the sort of state of Hong Kong now, the sooner they're going to be able to think with clarity about the true cost of doing business in Hong Kong today. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Johanna. Next, we'll go to Thomas to discuss a little more from the aspect of the law and what you think are the risks that businesses are facing.
Sure. Well, thank you, Eva. Thank you to the Atlantic Council, and of course, congratulations to Logan on a very important report. It couldn't come at a better time as businesses are starting to think about how do we respond to Hong Kong's reopening campaign. And I think it makes sense to take a hard look at what's happening on the rule of law front. As the report mentions, we have, thus far at least, a 100% conviction rate in terms of national security crimes. And my center, the Center for Asian Law, has tracked each and every arrest and each and every prosecution under the NSL. And put quite simply, most of these crimes, the vast majority of these crimes, would not be considered national security crimes in other leading democratic rule of law contexts. So you have right there a steady stream of cases that are demonstrating the politicization of the law and the legal system in Hong Kong. Now, what about the question of whether or not you could have a bifurcation of Hong Kong's legal system and still have, even as that politicization is taking place on the national security side, confidence in the legal system on the economic and private law side? Certainly, we can all hope that the parts of Hong Kong's legal system that are still functioning reasonably well will continue, but there is cause for concern there. If you look at the situation on the mainland, right, where, of course, many of us who have studied legal developments inside the PRC itself had voiced the hope that you would see a more and more robust and even quasi-independent legal system in the private law sector. Sadly, that hasn't happened, right? If the Communist Party wants to weigh in on a specific case regarding an important player on the business side in China, they will do that. Now, they'll balance some of the legal concerns, they'll balance some of the other equities in the picture, but they'll make a political determination on the quote-unquote right way to handle the case. And what I'm worried about in the Hong Kong context is that we'll see that kind of dynamic emerge, even though the national security law is meant first and foremost to target the pro-democratic political opposition, street activists who took to the streets in 2019. Those are the core targets right now. But the language of the law is so expansive that we can't guarantee that it won't be expanded to other sectors. Let me just make one other point before we turn it over to Victor. I think we should also have concerns about quality of legislation and policymaking in the Hong Kong context going forward. I think the COVID example is an excellent one in terms of politicization of what is meant to be a public health policy response, but sadly there are other areas to take a look at. I mean, one of Hong Kong's many strengths prior to 2019 is that you had a really amazing group of pro-democratic legislators who were also experts in private finance, who were also experts in the legal sector, right? Who are also experts in international business. The list goes on. And they were bringing that same level of expertise, that level of intellectual rigor to their work as legislators, right? They were not Johnny One-Notes, as it were, right? They were not only interested in democratic reform in Hong Kong. They were interested in a wide range of issues, and they were pushing for quality legislation on all those fronts. Now what we have is a much larger group of pro-Beijing legislators, many of whom are quite strong in some of these areas, some of whom are less so. And of course, many of those folks who are new to the legislature after the elections owe their seats in that body to their relationships with senior officials in China. So whether or not they would be able to exercise the kind of independent judgment that you like to see from a top legislative body is now a question as well. And that's another thing to watch going forward.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to our third panelist, Victor, who comes to this issue from studying elite Chinese politics. So I'm going to ask Victor to talk a bit about the view from Beijing and what Beijing's view is of what they want Hong Kong to be and what that means for individuals working in Hong Kong.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, first of all, thank you for having me as part of this event. I've, for a very long time, I've been a fan of Logan's work. And indeed, as the national security law was passed, myself and also my colleagues at UC San Diego just watched in horror, as the rule of law was dismantled, as Logan so detailed and analytically in his report. In terms of Beijing's objective of Hong Kong, I think the economic and financial objectives remain the same. Beijing would like Hong Kong to be China's window to the world. Even though on the trade front it's no longer so necessary for China as a whole, but on the financial front, Hong Kong remains very important because there's still a high level of capital control in mainland China. And so foreign investors, of course, hesitate to invest so much of the assets directly into mainland China. And, even someone like Mark Mobius apparently found out recently that once you do that in mainland China, you really can't get your money out. So by issuing securities in Hong Kong, where there's a relative degree of capital openness, global investors can still get exposure to Chinese assets while feeling, at least relative security in terms of their ability to get their money out when they want to. But as Logan pointed out, that is increasingly tenuous. So one of the things that I do wonder about, and maybe there's an opportunity, hopefully, for Logan to answer this, is of course, I agree that the ultimate sort of challenge to capital openness to Hong Kong is a potential capital flight from mainland China, because Hong Kong remains a window through which window can go out. And of course, in recent weeks, we've seen some tightening on that front already, with limiting the ability of mainland investors to invest in Hong Kong listed securities through the Connect. Are there other potential threats? Here I'm thinking about Hong Kong's own foreign exchange reserve, managed by the HKMA. It is, because of the peg, it is supposed to be entirely dollar or dollar pegged assets. Whether you've seen, whether your research has shown some changing composition of those assets from highly, the ideal is that it should be highly liquid dollar assets like US Treasuries. But of course, I think the main driver away from those assets, not necessarily geopolitical tension or anything, is just the pure demand for Chinese firms and banks to issue Hong Kong dollar denominated securities in Hong Kong, and the need for China to have buyers to buy up those assets, whether that has over time shifted the composition. Because the implication of that is that if those assets are actually not US Treasuries anymore, but like, let's say, shares of, Bank of China, Hong Kong, or something like that, those are not really assets that the HKMA can sell, because of course, if they began to sell them in response to the need for dollar liquidity, the price of those assets would drop, which is highly undesirable for China. So that potentially will have implications. So I do wonder whether that has changed. The other thing that I like, about the report, of course, is the recommendations at the end. But I wonder whether Logan may have some recommendations for the Hong Kong government, or even for the Chinese government, in terms of anything they can do that can maybe walk back some of the provisions of the national security law so as to assure global investors, or whether you think that basically, the national security law is so expansive that it's really hard for them to do anything to provide any credible assurances to global investors about the security of their assets if they're parked in Hong Kong. Anyway, I learned a lot from the report, and I urge everyone to read it carefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think wrapped in there was sort of a technical question for you.
Yeah, there's a couple of technical questions for Victor. I'm happy to address both of those. I mean, in terms of recommendations, and in terms of the second question, which is sort of an interesting one, I mean, I think the number one uncertainty is, where does the concept of national security begin and end in Hong Kong? And so can you actually define a limit to that that demonstrates where the government is not willing to tread, and because I think that's what business is really looking for. And the point is, most of these systems, as they're defined, are explicitly vague so that there is no barrier, and so that this can always be reinterpreted. The recommendation I would have is simply that business and finance is going to depend upon the legal defensibility of that standard either being explicit or implicit. Much better if it's explicit, because then it can be clarified accordingly. As Victor says, Beijing still depends upon Hong Kong as a conduit for capital inflows. The bigger concern is that the outflows from China are inevitable. China has the world's largest money supply, and therefore diversification into dollar assets from renminbi-denominated assets or non-renminbi-denominated assets is going to be an inevitable trend as households and corporates continue to diversify their savings. More of that is going to flow out through Hong Kong. That's going to persist regardless. The inflow back into China is not inevitable at all. It is contingent. And Hong Kong is Hong Kong's legal and institutional environment is a key channel for that inflow. And so that is, I think, exactly what's vulnerable and what Beijing needs to protect, which would be where their interests are at this stage. The financial markets in Hong Kong recently have shifted more toward, frankly, sort of managing for that outflow rather than managing for the inflow over time. If you've seen the sort of change in jobs within the financial industry, and the financial industry is still about 21% of Hong Kong's economy, off the top of my head, that may be slightly wrong, but it's in that range. If you look at the changes in composition of people working there, it's a lot less debt capital markets, equity capital markets, capital raising activity for money flowing to the mainland. It's a lot more private wealth management. And that means basically wealth management of Chinese high net worth individuals, which is more about the outflow itself. So you already see these sort of transformations taking place. And those are not necessarily equal bets, if you will, for the financial institutions engaging in them. Victor, regarding your second question on the sort of technical aspects of Hong Kong's reserves, I don't have any real research or insight into changes in the physical composition of Hong Kong's reserves. That's not really the threat I would be concerned about, is that Hong Kong's their reserves are running out. I mean, if you told the HKMA that there was going to be a significant period of capital outflows for 3 years, they would probably say, okay, we can be prepared for that and we can intervene accordingly, and Hong Kong's interest rates will go up consistent with those outflows, and therefore there will be a domestic offset to that, most likely in the domestic property market. That's probably not going to threaten the peg. If you tell them at the end of that 3 years that you're not sure what the status of the Hong Kong dollar is, that is something they can't necessarily prepare for. That is something they can't necessarily, and this is the sort of threat that I'm talking about a bit more distinctly in the report, in addition to the other threats to the business environment in terms of compliance obligations that you have to, being caught between both U.S. and Chinese legal environments at this point, the changes in the rule of law and institutions, the changes in the press environment and getting access to reliable information, as well as the data security questions that Johanna raised as well. So I don't think it's a direct threat to sort of the composition of assets or changes in the composition of assets that are the concern. The concern is more the political structure in which the Hong Kong's independent institutions operate. There's no necessary reason they have to come under threat, but people will gradually believe that it might not be in Beijing's interests to maintain those institutions in the same environment if there's a persistent capital outflow, which is sort of the scenario that I'm discussing.
Eva, could I just chime in quickly on the
definitely.
first part of the question in terms of steps that Beijing and by extension the Hong Kong government could take to reassure the international business community that Hong Kong truly is open for business? I think could really be helpful to see a scaling back of the implementation of the national security law, right? Wouldn't it be great if we went for 6 months or even a year with 0 national security law arrests? Part of the problem of the national security law is it's such a defining element of the narrative of Hong Kong internationally, right? Joanna just mentioned the trial of the 47 pro-democratic legislators that's going on right now. When we have a verdict in that case, which will come soon, and I fear it will be a guilty verdict, and then you have sentencing, which could be of several years, that's going to be a black mark on Hong Kong's record, and it's going to be dominating the international press coverage of Hong Kong. Some of those things, sadly, are priced in at this point. We know where that particular case is going. But one thing that the Hong Kong government could do and that Beijing could do to try to limit the damage, again, is to not continue to use the NSL in the rather robust way that they have thus far. So I think that's one option that they have on the table.
That makes sense. Now, at this point, we're going to start taking some questions from the audience, and we will do this sort of informally. So feel free, the panelists, to raise questions for each other, to interject anything except fist fighting. It's okay. So we'll take a question from the floor, which is, as the report notes, the intensifying strategic competition between the US and China also increases the risk of foreign companies operating in Hong Kong. I was wondering what companies should do in that situation, especially when facing both rising risk of US sanctions and the pressure from the national security law. So I don't know who wants to take a crack.
I mean, it's hard to know exactly what companies can do. I do know that this is an increasing concern that we saw on the ground when we're talking to companies in terms of their compliance obligations, precisely because you have new sanctions that prevent you from taking U.S. investments into certain securities, and you also have new entities that are new sanctions that you're all of a sudden being restricted from. Many Hong Kong institutions were being under pressure to no longer bank or provide banking services to people associated with the pro-democracy movement, for example. And we saw a lot of pressure in that respect, and numerous cases in which people who had left were having trouble sort of recovering their accounts at the same time. So there's all of this, there's all this uncertainty tied to the law about, are you going to be on one side or are you going to be on the wrong side, one side or the other of both of these legal systems, and are these going to overlap? There has been effective pushback, I think, by the financial industry against applying Beijing's anti-sanctions laws directly in Hong Kong, and that is an example of where the business community lobbying together can actually create or stall some of these changes over time. Now, it's no guarantee of reducing those risks going forward. And I think this is, given the reality of systemic competition and the fact that more entities are probably going to be designated for sanctions, and that China is pushing back very hard against the implementation of U.S. sanctions, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the potential for sanctions to expand. I think this isn't going away. Business needs to invest in these aspects and figuring out where those risks are most manageable and where is doing business in the territory going to damage global reputational risk in terms of your obligations to your customers? Is doing risk in the territory going to ignite a specific legal risk, either with respect to the U.S. or with China? And notably, if you look at the report and talking about the sanctions provisions, I mean, Hong Kong is not explicitly recognizing all U.S. sanctions. It's saying that we're recognizing sanctions imposed by the national security law, or by the UN Security Council, apologies, which is exactly why you have something like the Russian mogul Alexei Mordashov able to dock his yacht in Hong Kong last October, even though he's under sanctions. So there's this very fine line that the authorities are trying to walk in terms of presenting these options to the international financial industry. But it is certainly a far more difficult environment to operate in now than you were before, and you are probably running risks that you haven't encountered before, simply because these are new scenarios, given that Hong Kong is China's entry into the global dollar system, and because Beijing has an interest in it persisting as that will remain that entry point.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious what the panelists think about the relative pros and cons between Hong Kong and other cities in the region, because I think it's going to be a comparative decision that businesses make. There are risks and cons to working in Hong Kong that we've been discussing, but there's also cons to being in some other places. So if not Hong Kong, where else would business be going? Would it be Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul, somewhere else? And how do you weigh different cities against each other for the business environment now?
I mean,
I guess I'll chime in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say, at least just to start out on two of those issues that I mentioned, the rule of law, protection of IP. A Singapore right now, I think, offers better protection on both of those fronts, certainly than Hong Kong does.
Victor?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Joanna here. That I think Singapore is a prime beneficiary of what's happening in Hong Kong, but also what's happening in the U.S., right? So I gather there's some discussion of investment restrictions against U.S. investors to invest in certain kinds of Chinese assets. That business would have migrated to Hong Kong, but of course, investors are weary of the legal environment in Hong Kong. So most likely that kind of business of investing in Chinese companies will land in Singapore.
Well, I'm curious, what is the argument for staying in Hong Kong? Because a lot of companies are still there. So, there's rising legal risks, rising sanctions risk, but what?
Well, I mean, I can speak to if anyone wants to chime in. I mean, I think that for many businesses, they have built profitable, enterprises in Hong Kong on the debt capital markets, equity capital markets, business and finance. This used to be the regional headquarters for most people's mainland China operations, and so there's a lot of talent that is still in Hong Kong and operating there. So the sunk costs involved and the difficulties of adjusting are quite considerable. And so that gives many people pause about fully decommitting because just if you're going to change your position in Hong Kong, are you doing so to get actually closer to the mainland, to basically say that these are the same risks, or are you doing so to exit the market entirely? Regardless of how we've been discussing, sort of the broad ongoing process of supply chain diversification, of decoupling, I mean, I don't think that financial decoupling is likely to be a reality anytime soon. At this stage, it'll be harder and harder for Beijing to convince investors that it is a place worth investing. But nonetheless, globally, there's still a very low proportion of renminbi-denominated assets in global portfolios. And so this is kind of Beijing's burden to do so in that sense, rather than people's active decision to diversify, because all of those flows need to increase over time. But for many companies, I mean, this is still a very large consumer market in the mainland. This is still going to be, there are very few of its size elsewhere in the world. And so that retains the, that gives everyone pause. The point of the report is that everyone in the business community wants to believe that nothing really has changed and those advantages persist, and that's exactly where the Hong Kong government's sort of official line has come out. And the point of considering this is that how do you objectively analyze what has shifted? How do you objectively analyze the risks that have developed virtually overnight during these 3 years of COVID? For many companies, and I'll close with this, but for many companies, they've sort of, I think, delayed what to do about China's strategy overall during COVID years because nobody could travel, nobody could visit their businesses, and now they're revisiting those decisions. And so I think this is, part of this discussion is what are the benefits and costs, and how have the costs risen, and how do you address that over time?
I mean, just to what you said, I think you said it perfectly. Everybody wants to believe that nothing has changed, but everything has changed. I mean, I loved your recommendation of saying, it would be great if there could be a moratorium on prosecutions under the national security law. Sure, but the national security law will still be there. And I think pretty much everyone on the panel has said the history of how Beijing acts is that if it sees a political reason to do something, it will do it. So, as long as it's there, the threat will always be there of that intervention. And so, as I said, I think the shift has been so fundamental already. To your point of why stay, I think that is a serious question that companies need to do. Taking into account everything that Logan said, but I think that they need to be very clear-eyed about thinking through that question.
Can I just add one point to those, all of those excellent points, which is to say that, I think that the shifting business environment behooves the companies that are staying to do exactly what the report recommends, which is be talking to both the Hong Kong government and Beijing about the bottom line dynamics that they're seeing and the very difficult choices that they're facing. We had a brief moment of potential warming in the U.S.-China relationship in December and early January, where Beijing seemed to be sending some signals that they wanted to put a floor on the U.S.-China relationship. We then had the balloon incident, and that proved to be much more damaging to that initial effort than people might have expected. Having said that, I think there is an opportunity there for Beijing to say, okay, let's try to do, if not a full reset, then let's try to take some steps in a more positive direction. Hong Kong can be a big part of that. And signaling to the international community and the international business community that Beijing gets that there has to be a new narrative on Hong Kong, and that there will be only be a new narrative if and when they change their approach to the national security law and some of the other things that they've done in Hong Kong. That's the key going forward, I think.
That makes sense. I'd like to ask Victor to talk a little bit about the Two Sessions meeting that's going on now in Beijing. Are there any signals from that as far as Hong Kong? And more broadly, what is the takeaway from this meeting?
Well, there's so much to say. I find Qin Gang's long Q&A last night to be very striking. I mean, as Tom was saying, there was, some signs of Beijing wanting to reset the bilateral relationship. The balloon incident and clearly Qin Gang's very clear signaling last night clearly, does not suggest a reset. So, and by the way, I do have to say, for China to say, oh, the US is overreacting, and he literally said that last night. I mean, that is going to open the door to, anyway, people in the US will have to get away with that, because, once you start charging each other of being overreacting over sovereignty, territorial issues, where does it end? So that's one thing. Of course, Xi Jinping did try to reassure the private entrepreneur community in mainland China. He had a special session with the Democratic Alliance, it's one of the democratic parties in China, which is populated by, private businesses. And he said that, oh, you are part of us, 我们是自己人. Meaning to reassure private business people that their interests will be protected by the party. But of course, we have to remember that people who are in the Chinese Communist Party, they literally have no legal rights, because when they're accused of corruption, they can be detained by the Central Discipline and Inspection Commission without any due process. So I would say that's not especially reassuring, to say that, oh, you are just like us. It's not very reassuring. And then, of course, their growth targets being modest and stuff, setting up an easy win for the new premier, the new vice premier is coming in. The other thing that is related to Hong Kong that I'm a little bit worried about is that the new financial technocrats, they're much more domestically oriented than their predecessors. So, officials like Guo Shuqing and Yi Gang, they've had a lot of international exposure from early on in their careers. They have a lot of friends overseas, which for the party, that is a little bit problematic. But for China, they have really brought a lot to the table, because they're able to, and also very comfortable to talk to international investors, international financial institutions like the IMF, and negotiate with them different things that China would like to have. With this new crop of financial technocrats, I think this kind of more informal friendship and network is going to be a lot weaker, and potentially that's going to make China's engagement with these international investors and financial institutions more difficult.
Thank you, Victor. Another question from the audience. What do all these developments in Hong Kong mean for Shanghai and its role as a financial hub?
I mean, I can kind of take that. I think that Shanghai was, labeled as it's going to become an international financial hub by 2015. This was a long time ago. There's always many long-term objectives like this that don't end up being fulfilled or end up being pushed back for quite some time. I mean, the key constraint is what's happening in terms of capital controls and the ability to operate in the mainland anyway. in terms of finance and raising capital. So I'm, I don't think it's too they're necessarily so closely linked per se that mainland capital markets have sort of operated independently of Hong Kong for some time, and they've been trying to develop, virtually on their own and grown in size. And yes, there'll probably be more A share listings relative to H share listings over time, but that's a broader trend that's taken place. The bigger problem with the mainland markets is sort of the investor base remains sort of very technical analysis based, so very momentum trading oriented. There's very few institutional investors there, so you get very different kinds of characteristics across those markets. It's a broader question about how you think Chinese companies will be raising capital in terms of the relative basis, but I don't think it's necessarily so. Developments in Hong Kong won't have that much of an influence on Shanghai one way or the other, I think. Yep.
Another question from the audience. Does it still remain in China's interest to have a region with the ability to pursue more open economic and legal policies, such as Hong Kong?
I would say yes, certainly. One of the great things about Hong Kong, and all of us have spent serious amounts of time there, and Joanna mentioned her own deep experience there. I think that Hong Kong has been great in part because it offers such a robust window on China. And that window is many-faceted, right? Part of it is the economic and financial piece that the report describes so very well, but part of it is political, legal, and even almost sort of cultural, sociological, right? That you have this place where people are in a more open environment trying to grapple with all sorts of developments on the mainland. My own understanding of what's happening in China has been so deeply enriched by years of conversations with colleagues at Hong Kong University, at some of the other universities in Hong Kong, some of the civil society organizations in Hong Kong. They're all doing they had been doing all been doing top flight work prior to the national security law on helping the world to understand what's happening in mainland China. And I think China benefits from that in terms of a broader international understanding of where they are and where they're going. I think Hong Kong has repeatedly, over the course of the past 40 years of reform and opening, served as sort of an ideas lab for mainland China, whether it be on the economic reform front or on the political reform front, and that role is now also in doubt. So there's a lot of equities for China and for the Communist Party itself in terms of the trajectory in Hong Kong that should force them to rethink. Sadly, I'm not predicting that, but I am hoping it.
Yeah, I would just add, this is a real tension in Beijing's position at this point, because they need the continued foreign inflows, and they need continued engagement with the international financial system. And despite all the concern and that's been raised about, China needed to become more self-reliant and more insulated in terms of using renminbi-denominated transactions and developing their own sort of financial institutions, you continue to see this very persistent drumbeat of calls for openness and calls for additional foreign investment and additional inflows. Hong Kong is going to be the channel for that, which is a huge tension with the way they've acted in the last toward Hong Kong in the last 2 to 3 years. And so you have this dynamic where Beijing needs to keep their relations with the linkages between Hong Kong and the mainland increasingly tight in the security realm, but they need to keep the linkages between Hong Kong and the rest of the world, increasingly tied in an economic realm. That's where they're going to have to moderate one of those two positions. And this is exactly sort of the tension that the report describes. And I think over time, this is still going to lead to some sort of we are certainly not seeing this now, but you continue to see the sort of pro-technocratic and reform has been very slow in China, but these more reformist kind of voices, you continue to see them pop up to the surface with things like the liberalization of China's onshore stock listings over time to try to encourage additional foreign inflows. This impetus to try to deliver additional foreign investment into China will not go away, and Hong Kong's going to be a part of that. So they have a huge interest in it, and that is, in my view and in the discussion in the report, an opportunity for leverage and an opportunity for the business and financial industry to talk about that explicitly and to talk about what policies need to be changed to facilitate those objectives.
So I think one thing that everyone agrees on is that the U.S.-China conflict is not going away. It's going to be a long-term competition, great power struggle. So I'm curious how you think Hong Kong is going to play into that. What is Hong Kong's role going to be in the U.S.-China rivalry?
Victor, do you want to take that? Or?
Whoever wants to take that on.
I mean, the only thing I'll say, it's going to be nothing like the Cold War, the original Cold War, one would say. I mean, Hong Kong is solidly a part of China, which was not the case, from a legal sense, of course, during the original Cold War, when it was a British colony. So I agree with Logan that this kind of financial flows, how that's going to get managed, given the restrictions from both China and also from the United States, that's going to be very interesting. But I think a lot of this, so I guess that's what I will say there. I mean, that there is this kind of interesting dynamic in that, Chinese assets are in general have lower returns now than dollar assets because of high interest rates. And it was very striking to me, Qin Gang last night actually mentioned that as a source of problem between the two countries. And that's a very odd thing to say for foreign minister, to say that, interest rates are too high in the US and that's causing a problem. So I think that is another reason why Chinese assets are not very attractive right now, because they just have lower yields, and the return on equities for equities also relatively low on average. I mean, you have these stellar companies, Alibaba, Tencent, etc. But the SOEs, as Logan has documented over the years, they tend to have very low returns, and now even fixed income have low returns. So I think that's a kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to what Victor says is that from a sanctions perspective, Hong Kong's very central in terms of when we think about where sanctions are going to be applied, are being applied right now to Chinese companies in the future, where Chinese sanctions or resistance of sanctions against international firms might be applied. Hong Kong is going to be the nexus of that, and that's exactly one of the risks talked about in the report for how business sort of need to look at and manage those risks. So if we're thinking about,
why is Hong Kong going to be the nexus of that?
Because that's China's entry into the dollar the dollar trading world, essentially, because this is exactly the conduit through which, as Victor said earlier, as we've discussed, the legal and institutional framework in Hong Kong facilitates investors a certain degree of protection when that legal in terms of investing in mainland securities via the Connect programs, the Bond Connect, Stock Connect, when that comes under question, that jeopardizes those potential inflows. And for example, when in the waning days of the Trump administration, you had certain companies designated as linked to the Chinese military and therefore uninvestable, huge sell-offs in those companies in the Hong Kong marketplace, and then mainland investors swooping down to buy those, to buy those at a discount. We're going to see a lot more of that kind of nexus taking place in Hong Kong over the years, and I think its significance within that conflict is that if we're thinking about the use of increasingly economic statecraft instruments, it's going to be at the front line of those battles.
I would say, I think that in addition to what's been said, the sort of question of the status of Hong Kong in terms of its sort of freedom and democratic practice is also going to be an element. It has been already. I think the way in which the Biden administration has been evaluating can Hong Kong be treated as a separate entity from China moving forward? Hong Kong has a number of champions on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle. This recently set up commission on China. I expect we'll be looking at not simply just sort of the business aspects, but also what is happening in the democratic space, what is happening to fundamental freedoms in Hong Kong, and how does that influence policy making from the US side.
Can I just add one quick point to all of those excellent points, which is to say, it's been fascinating to me as someone who's worked on Hong Kong for a long time to see the level of conversation here in Washington on Hong Kong rise dramatically over the past 3 years. And so that has been a challenge for Beijing and will be a challenge for Hong Kong as it's attempting this new rollout, but it's also an opportunity in the sense that if there is a recalibration of policy towards Hong Kong, a renewed commitment to Hong Kong's autonomy and to human rights in Hong Kong, people will notice that. And so Beijing can sort of say, let's use this moment in time to, again, to reestablish Hong Kong's autonomy vis-a-vis Beijing and use that as a bridge towards a better relationship with the United States. So the opportunity is there.
Mm-hmm. So earlier we touched on recommendations for what the Chinese government could do to reassure investors. And there's question from the floor about if there are any suggestions for the U.S. or Western governments as far as policy making, particularly in protecting U.S. companies that are operating in Hong Kong.
Logan?
Yeah, I mean, this is really more addressed toward, the report is really addressed a lot more toward policy in Hong Kong itself. I mean, I think I know that there's a lot of legislation sort of brewing on ways in terms of, ways of trying to, isolate or insulate certain investments from investments in Hong Kong or, Chinese companies overall. I think that there is this question of how do you separate Hong Kong's status from the mainland? When is that advantageous to U.S. companies? When is that disadvantageous to their own interests? When does this actually impose costs on U.S. companies operating in Hong Kong, disproportionate to what their own interests are, even if it's intellectually consistent to say that these should no longer be treated separately? I don't think it's really in the U.S. interest per se to really be creating sort of risk-reward calculations for companies on an ongoing basis, besides sort of making companies aware of the risks that are there. And the reason being, well, first, it's just not something that government's probably going to be very good at doing. Second of all, that's sort of the burden of Beijing. That's sort of the burden of Beijing to demonstrate that this is still a good place to do business. And that's where I think a more modest approach toward thinking about warning companies of risks and creating sort of the transparency around those risks is probably more called for, rather than pursuing more aggressive restrictions toward decisions that companies are already grappling with anyway.
I actually have a question for Tom. Is there anything the UK can do? I mean, from what I can gather, Hong Kong, the courts in Hong Kong, legal profession in Hong Kong is still part of this kind of British common law system. And then you have these UK, Australian judges who are still serving in Hong Kong. Does that give, Britain or that legal system any leverage to make things better in Hong Kong, or is it just not possible somehow?
Yeah, I mean, there is that political leverage, and I think the UK has attempted to use it from time to time. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about the so-called non-permanent judges and whether they should step down and protest over some of the dynamics that are happening there with the national security law. And the report notes this Tim Owen controversy, right? Tim Owen being a very prominent human rights barrister in the UK who was working on the Jimmy Lai case, and pressure was put on the Hong Kong judicial system to have him step down or not allow him to take part in that case. And I think the message from the UK government should be, look, Hong Kong's success as an economic and legal model is part based on the ties that it does have, right, to the international system and to the sort of Commonwealth common law system that has been there for decade after decade. There have been a number of different steps that have weakened that, and I think what the UK needs to be saying is, look, the more that you do damage to this kind of interlinkage, the more that Hong Kong's rule of law reputation will suffer, and the more businesses will be asking the kinds of questions that are posed in Logan's report. So you're absolutely right, Victor, that there are some opportunities there.
So we're beginning to come up to near the end of our time. So I'm going to ask a quick question on income tax, and then I'm going to ask if people have some final remarks to wrap up.
That's for you, Logan.
I probably don't know. Yeah.
So Hong Kong's had the advantage of the 15% income tax rate. Do you see Beijing moving that to mainland income tax levels? Why would they do it, and how would they manage it?
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I hadn't thought about that. Increasingly, Beijing's also pursuing sort of a global tax system for Chinese citizens. So they're trying to enforce global taxation at mainland rates, regardless of where your income comes from. So that would be, but that's a broader trend that's been underway. If Hong Kong formally harmonized their tax system with, with the mainland, obviously that'd be a tremendous disadvantage to competitiveness of attracting talent and operating there. But that's all I could really say. I haven't heard anything or know anything that's brewing.
Final remarks from our panelists.
Thanks, Eva. Thanks everyone for joining. I would just say encourage everyone to take a look at the report. I think this is a very interesting time for reevaluating some of these risks that have developed over the last 2 to 3 years since the national security law has been implemented, and to try to do so objectively and to try to assess that things really have changed on the ground. You have to be prepared for a very different environment than where we entered before the pandemic, and urge everyone to take a look to do that. Please, sorry.
I mean, I just say, as I said earlier, I think the whole idea that Hong Kong is back depends on the Hong Kong government and others trying to shape a narrative around Hong Kong that just doesn't exist anymore, and certainly not as a global business hub in the way that it used to be. And so I think for people who are concerned about that, I really think looking at how to reshape that narrative, about what Hong Kong has become is where a focus can be. There are some excellent organizations already doing that, and so coalescing around those messages, I think, would be key.
And just 2 quick points. One would be, I think China, over the past 40, 50 years since reform and opening began in the late 70s, China has succeeded the most when it's the most ideologically and politically flexible. And what has happened in Hong Kong over the past 2, 3 years is a deeply ideological approach to the one country, two systems model that would benefit from a fresh look, and that would benefit from a historically informed fresh look at what has worked over the past 50 years in terms of China's own economic development and Hong Kong's role in that. Second point would be to sort of say, again, the more that the Hong Kong government and Beijing ease up on the court system and give them the space that they need to deal with this new law in these cases, the better they're going to be able to perform. The political pressure on the judiciary is extremely high, and if Beijing and Hong Kong would back up a little bit and give them the space they need to do their jobs, I think you'd see a decline in the negative impact, not a zero level, but a decline in the negative impact of the NSL. So that's something else I'm looking at going forward.
Victor.
Yeah, no, I just would urge people to read the report, which contains a lot of very fascinating analysis and details, and also refocuses our attention to the economic dimension of Hong Kong, which I think is very important. A very striking graph toward the beginning of the report is the population decline in Hong Kong, which I hadn't realized the scale was so large. A couple 100,000 people in a city of 6 to 7 million people leaving it over the course of actually more were leaving, because that's a net outflows. And these are some of the most educated people. Financial assets also are being lost from Hong Kong. Even though it is a small place in terms of population in the context of China, it is, a place where there's incredible amount of wealth has been made and kept. And for Hong Kong to really go down economically and financially would be a huge loss to China and to the world.
Thank you. So thank you to Logan, Johanna, Tom, Victor. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for putting together this panel, and thanks to the audience for showing up and tuning in.
Well, David, thank you so much for fantastic moderating and taking us through all the intricacies and nuances of Logan's wonderful paper. I want to thank everyone for being with us this morning. Logan, when I first read the report, and I had the privilege of being part of earlier versions of this, the same thing that struck me today struck me then, which there are two themes in tension, and you just talked about this a few minutes ago. The first is the deep and complex financial system Hong Kong has built up over decades, and how critical that is for the world and how the world does business with mainland China. And this is what we hear from the financial centers of the world. We hear it from New York, we hear it from London. And the second is the growing and darkening political environment that's being created in Hong Kong and the enormous risks that presents. And this is what we hear from Washington and the political capitals of the world. And your report, and frankly, I haven't seen this done other places, lays out both concretely, the political and the financial all at once. And it puts it in one place. And the one conclusion you have to have when you see that is something has to give. Both can't continue to exist in tension, and something will break or have to be reformed one way or the other. And this idea of breaking down the divisions between political and financial centers is what animates our work at the Geoeconomics Center and will continue to animate our work and research going forward. So I want to thank Logan for his expertise. I want to thank all our partners in this project. I want to thank Dave Schulman and our friends at the Global China Hub, Matt Dracy and Colleen Cottle, and a special thanks to Niels Graham of the Geoeconomics Center, without whom this report would not have been possible. And thank you all for being with us this morning, and we wish you a great rest of the day.